welcome to another edition of Kirklees Local Television's Weekly Wind-Up, the programme that brings issues to you, the people of Kirklees. Joining me on this week's show, Jamie Ross from Simon on the Streets, a homeless organisation based in Leeds that also operates in Huddersfield, Callum Knight, a Weekly Wind-Up resident, and also joining us is Robin Bowles, a local resident and Quaker. We have three heavyweight topics this week for our guests to discuss. Firstly, we'll be looking at homelessness. What is the situation for the region's homeless? And who makes up the homeless people that are currently without residence in Kirklees? Then we'll look at student fees. Who is benefiting from the rise in student fees? And which parties might be looking to reduce student fees in the upcoming general elections? Then we move on to protest movements. What power does protesting have? And what will the future of protests be if they continue to fall on deaf ears? We go straight into the topic of homelessness. There are many issues surrounding the homeless of the Kirklees area. Kirklees Council say that to classify as homeless, you must have no accommodation available to you in the UK or elsewhere. And that you must also have a priority need, such as a dependent child or somebody who is currently pregnant living with you. I'll come to you firstly, Jamie. If this is the case that you have to meet certain criteria to be regarded as homeless, can we really get a realistic representation of the number of homeless within a region?
No, is the short, sharp answer to that, but it really depends on how you define homelessness. There's homelessness in its sort of in its actual definition, which is, as you stated, without an abode, without nowhere to lay your head. There's street homelessness, which is where we come in as an organisation, and there's people at rough sleep. They're all three very different definitions, but have the overall sort of nowhere to stay, to call a home. The way that they get the statistics usually is by the people that present at local authorities and say, I'm in need of housing. All those people that just present, most of those will have the motivation to be able to, and the understanding and the ability to be able to go into a formal situation like that in a housing, fill out forms, present themselves, articulate themselves properly. What happens to all the people that, don't have those skills, all those people that you see out on the streets? Do they still get counted? I don't think they do.
So as an organisation, how does Simon on the Streets approach the homeless situation? In terms of how do you engage with the people that are currently living on the streets?
It's a very good question. It's one that's usually asked to us, and quite simply, like people, we go up and we treat people like people. We see the person before the issue as such, and we're completely outreach based, which means we have no offices as such. We have offices to do our paperwork and stuff, but it's all out on people's terms. And yeah, we just present, we get in front of people. We don't impose on people, but we'll walk past, try and get eye contact and say, somebody that we haven't seen before, morning. Usually you get nothing, and it can take a long time to get that first sort of chink, that first open up of somebody. And that's a good basis for a foundation then to start building a relationship.
Absolutely. There's been quite a bit in the media in the last few years about soldiers returning from war zones making up an increasing amount of not just our area but the nation's homeless. Is this something that as an organisation you've seen?
Again, yes, I've seen ex-servicemen and women on the streets. But what you will usually find is those people again may have sort of the motivation and the understanding to be able to get themselves into some form of housing, supported housing, or have a support structure around them to be able to still be homeless, but to crash at somebody's house as such, you're technically still homeless. Yeah. It's not something that we come across often in our organisation, because we deal with the people that are at the bottom of the well, the people who have fallen through the net, who have no service provision from anywhere else. But yeah, we do come across people, and yeah, we do signpost to other services. It is an issue.
Absolutely, yeah. So, as an issue, Callum, do you think it's something that, as a country, we could do better at providing welfare and housing for returning soldiers?
For returning soldiers, yeah, obviously we can't, I mean, none of us have been soldiers, so we can't imagine what it's like being in a war zone. But we can imagine, say, like coming back to normal society is hard, and, you know, they have personal issues, psychological issues sometimes, and sometimes that can lead to a breakdown in the family or not being able to secure a job, which, you know, eventually will lead to homelessness. And so I just think there needs to be rehabilitation centres, units, whatever, to help ex-service people get back in society and get a life that they may have left behind.
Many people have preconceived ideas regarding homeless people to do with sort of alcoholism, drug abuse, even mental health issues as well. Robin, what do you think society can do to get past some of these stereotypes?
I guess really, like we were hearing, you know, treating people, starting by saying these are people, you know, they're no different from us. It could be any of us, could be in that situation at some point in our lives, and it's quite likely that some of us have known somebody, or somebody connected to us in some way will have been in that kind of situation. So something really important to do is to never stigmatise people, I guess, and really supporting organisations like Simon on the Street, you know, perhaps for ordinary people, is one of the best things that we can do, and you know, they can speak on our behalf in a sense.
Final question really for you, Jamie. Where can people go who are at risk of becoming homeless to get the help that they need? And as well, even people who currently are homeless, where would you advise them to go?
Very first port of call is your local authority. You know, it is very difficult, and to go to a local authority and sit through a very big assessment, and in the end to be told that you're not in priority need, so therefore they have no duty to house you. But that's your first port of call. They won't just say, right, that's it, we're done. They have other options. There's always private rented. There's you know, there's lots of different organisations and housing options out there for people. So the local authority would be the first port of call, dependent where you are in your homeless situation, of course.
Absolutely. And if people wanted to find out more about your organisation or even get involved with it, how would they go about doing that? Well,
you can. We're called Simon on the Streets. We actually, very good question. We're doing on the 25th September a big fundraising event. It's a big sleep out, and it is about the raising awareness and changing mindsets. It's at www.sleepwithsimon.co.uk, and all the information's on there. Or you can just have a look at Simon on the Streets on the internet. We have blogs on there and things about case studies, obviously anonymised case studies, but yeah, go online and check it out. It's a brilliant thing.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this topic. Please do get in contact with us by the usual means. You can contact us on our email, info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, or you can find us on Twitter by searching @TheWeeklyWindup. Thank you. Join us after this break. And welcome back. We move straight on to the topic of student fees. The formulation of the coalition government held slim hopes for many that student fees may not rise by the amount that Mr Cameron had been campaigning on. This hope being supported by Nick Clegg's vehement campaigning against the increasing of student fees. Despite this being the case, student fees have tripled under the coalition. I'll come to you firstly, Callum. who do you think that current student fees are benefiting the most? Do you think it's students, universities, university heads?
None of what you've just listed, I'm afraid. Students, definitely not. I mean, being landed with a £27,000 debt before you're 23 is ridiculous. I mean, graduates haven't even had a proper job where they can even pay that back. Universities, the fees currently in the current system don't go to the universities. They're for the government, and it was to initially to reduce the deficit, like all government policy was at the time. And in fact, university budgets are still being cut. So even though it went from 3,000 straight up to 9,000, there wasn't even a middle point. There's just none of that money goes back into universities, and tutors are not being paid well, library budgets are being cut, tuition, like contact time is being cut, which contact time in university is vital. I mean, it's supposed to be independent study, and obviously, you know, you do dissertations and you do research, and that's all well and good, but without contact time, you've not got that pathway into what you want to do. And no, it's benefiting the central government at the time. I mean, now it's quite interesting. The threshold was at 48.6% of people after they've graduated, to be able to pay their tuition fees back. And in 2010, when it was introduced, it was 28% of students couldn't pay it back, but the threshold was 48, so it still benefited the government then. In 4 years, it's gone up to 45%. So you know, if that correlation continues, in the next 2 years, it will reach the threshold of 48.6% of students that can't pay the fees back, in which case it no longer benefits anybody.
Do you see this as a fair situation, Robin, for students and future students even?
I think, well, when I was a student, it was free to be a student, and that meant anybody, in theory, could study at a higher level without having this worry and even worse, this disincentive for studying. Education, it just ties into the kind of things that we're talking about later on about protests as well. You know, uneducated people are much more likely to have a sense of control over their own lives as well and not be intimidated. And so free access to education at all levels is absolutely vital to a healthy democratic society.
Jamie, do you feel like the increasing in student fees has restricted people on a class basis in terms of who can go to university?
Well, yeah, in a way. You know, who from a working class background, I don't like putting classes on it. People that don't have brilliantly paid jobs, parents, single parents, you know, how are those kids ever going to be able to go to uni apart from, you know, the little ins and the sort of the funding that you can get? But that's still taking away a whole generation of kids, even people with well-paid jobs. You know, how can you afford to pay, what is it a year now? Nine grand a year. That's half of a lot of people's wages. So yeah, I don't like to put class on it, but the people that can afford to will be able to. The people who can't won't. It's that simple. And education is key, I believe, in whatever you're doing in life.
What I would just say to that as well, you say that, you know, 9 grand is half of a lot of people's wage. You only start paying it back if you're earning 21 grand a year. From experience or from people you might know, I don't know anyone who's walked into a graduate job who's got a yearly wage of over 21 grand.
No, me neither.
Yeah. I think in terms of democracy, if you've got basically the more wealthy increasingly being the people who are being educated, then when they reach positions of power, which they do tend to if you have a high education, then they're going to be, broadly speaking on the behalf of people similar to them. And so it further disempowers the people who haven't had that education, and that's the vast majority of us, really.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for on student fees. Once again, however, you can contact us on our email, info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, or you can find us on Twitter by searching @theweeklywindup. Now we go on to the topic of protest. There seems to be increasingly diverse ways in which people are choosing to protest. There's recently been a case of people protesting against an oil company by using Lego models with protest signs outside one of their filling stations. Do you feel that this is a reaction to protest movements losing their effectiveness?
I think it's actually a sign of increasing effectiveness, I think, because it's showing that people are using creative, diverse ways of protesting. It's something that I'd never thought of, and it grabs people's attention. It's not what you'd expect to see at a protest. And I think it emphasises the fact that people are still protesting, and they always have done, and they always will do. And protest is effective. It does bring about change.
How would you go about gauging the effectiveness of not necessarily a single protest, but of protests?
Some protest movements are very defined, and they know what they want, and they can measure their success by whether they've got it or not. But other times there's sort of spin-offs really from protest, and I'm thinking, we're marking 100 years since the outbreak of the First World War, and here in Huddersfield there was a really strong anti-war movement, very strong. There's a book by Cyril Pearce which documents that, and that movement led, amongst other things, helped lead to the recognition of conscientious objection as a legal right, and that was a massive step forward in human rights in this country. And it wasn't perhaps what they were intending to do when they started out, but that's what it helped bring about.
For me, one of the sort of big protests in my lifetime was against the lead up to the war in Iraq. There were sort of millions of people on the streets across Britain, but as well quite a big movement in Huddersfield as well. It seemed to many at the time that those protests fell on deaf ears, really, in terms of the government still went ahead and went to war in Iraq. What other ways do you think there are for the general populace to make central government listen, Callum?
It's hard, because I think, like you mentioned, the protest against the oil company. I think personally that's a move away from conventional protest, because they're not being listened to. You talked about the protest against Iraq, and the student fees one in 2011, 2012. It's incredibly policed nowadays. It's very easy to diffuse protest movements just by kettling and having a police presence there. People are less likely now to not break the law, because we don't, protests are supposed to be something else, peaceful protests or whatever. I'm struggling now to find things that people can do differently to get the awareness that certain movements deserve. Like, at the time, they get a lot of recognition, and there's stuff on the news and stuff. It's afterwards, after that dies down, people just, not people, but policy doesn't get changed like it used to, and it largely gets ignored after the initial protest.
Is that something you agree with?
Well, I think just picking up on what you're talking about, the protests on the 15th of February in 2003 against the forthcoming Iraq War, I think it's really important to actually see the successes of that it's and this is things that are not well known, but it created hugely destabilised the Labour government and led to an event called Wobbly Tuesday on the 11th of March in that year, where the cabinet were in disarray. They were on the verge of the defence minister was arguing for not being part of the American invasion. So it was on a knife edge there. It forced Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, to go back to Parliament, which he really didn't want to do. It forced them to delay the invasion. It forced them to go to the UN, which again they didn't want to do, and they couldn't get a majority there. And it fatally weakened Blair and I think highlighted the mistrust that people have in politicians.
Come to you now, Jamie. What do you think people might do in future if the powers that be kind of maintain that sort of, I mean, we hear about this changes in policy and things like that, but if it's kept quite under the carpet almost and kept behind closed doors, what do you think people might start approaching to get the voices heard?
It's a big question, isn't it? At the end of the day, to protest, it's to try and have your voice heard. It's whether that's acknowledged or not, whether it is heard and acknowledged, and whether it isn't. I don't see what people could be doing different. Really, I think protest can work, has worked, and does work. Not all the time. If not just to raise awareness for a cause, I think it's a good thing. What else can you do? Bar
Revolution.
Yeah, pure revolution. But I don't know what else, to be honest with you. Yeah. I'm not going to try and answer because I have no idea.
That is absolutely fair enough. And just as a final question to yourself, Robin, you were mentioning there the sort of things that you might not actually recognise that protest led to. Do you think the protest movement against the war in Iraq and the subsequent things that happened afterwards have made it more possible for current governments to accuse Tony Blair or charge Tony Blair with war crimes?
It has definitely. I mean, he can't walk around anywhere without bodyguards now. He's completely discredited in most people's eyes. And again, what you were saying, Jamie, that protest is effective, and it is worth getting involved, and it is a way for ordinary people to change their own lives.
That's great, thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time now. I mean, this is a topic that I would certainly like to discuss a lot more, but you can always have your say. You can do so by email, info@kirkleeslocaltv.com. And you can also do so by searching on Twitter for @theweeklywindup. Thank you very much to all my guests for joining me on today's show. Please do join me next week for a discussion about ID cards and whether crime is sensationalised in the media. Thank you very much. I've been Kyle Warwick, and goodbye.